What if you could live like a king, but at the same time shrink your footprint by a factor of 14? Woohoo! Living sustainably without giving up your steak, your car, or your McMansion. We'll be talking about that on this episode of the GrowthBusters podcast.
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast, sharing the journey to living more sustainably. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, and I host this podcast because we do need to bust our addiction to growth, our obsession with having more of everything year after year on a finite planet. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. Now, in our last episode, we bid adieu to co-hosts Caitlin Hickman and Ben Bacher. Today, we welcome a new co-host for at least the next several episodes, Dana Hickey. Welcome to the team, Dana.
Hi, Dave.
How's it feel so far to be sitting at the microphone?
It's cool. It's really neat to talk about sustainability to other people.
Well, good. I'm glad that that's an important subject for you, because otherwise you wouldn't be invited to be sitting at the table. Now, Dana, you're a student at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology. What are you studying there?
I'm studying literature, media, and communications. So it's a lot about trying to convey information to people, graphic design, and things related to that. A really neat topic that can be applied to a lot of things, even sustainability.
Yep. And you also have some experience and expertise in sustainability because of some student organizations that you've been working with.
Yeah, I'm a part of Greek Sustainability at Georgia Tech. I'm one of the exec members. I'm also in Student Government Sustainability, and then also Sustainability Chair in my sorority. So sustainability all around at Georgia Tech.
Sounds like you live and breathe sustainability. That's good, because that's what we do at the GrowthBusters podcast. So what are we going to talk about today, Dana?
We're talking about the movie called Downsizing. This is a movie that's just coming out on DVD, and it's really applicable to the topics we talk about here, because these people want to limit their environmental impact, so they're shrinking down. Yeah,
now this film stars Matt Damon and Kristen Wiig. And first of all, I just want to say I was glad to see the movie, because anytime there's a film that addresses in some form or fashion the subjects of overpopulation, overconsumption, overshoot, and or climate change, I'm pretty excited to see those dealt with in some form or fashion.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting movie because how it was marketed, I thought was just a different standpoint, was really good, because they marketed it as a comedy, and it had a lot of people that want that draw in, be like, oh, I want to see this movie. What's it about? Like, why is there a 13-centimeter tall man? And I think that idea of trying to get people involved, and then they realize, like, oh, this is sustainability related. Like, I thought that was really clever of them to kind of have that social commentary hidden in.
Yeah, this wasn't a documentary. This isn't like trying to get people to go see the latest Al Gore documentary or Michael Moore documentary even, but actually to go see an entertaining, what they call a narrative film, comedy and science fiction, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think that's a good step for the environmentalists out there. That's like you can go through the mainstream media and still get those ideas of trying to be sustainable, because that's where a lot of people will listen to it and maybe change their mindset about sustainability. The
basic story of the film is that scientists come up with a way to actually shrink human beings down to like about 1/14 of their original size. And the scientists developed that because they were concerned about overpopulation. So this seemed like a really great solution to overpopulation and to climate change, largely driven by overpopulation, is we just shrink everybody. If we miniaturize them, we miniaturize their footprint, right?
Yeah.
However, in the film, even though we're given that information, most of the people who are marketed to and who are making this decision, which is a big decision to permanently shrink yourself and your family, most of them aren't doing it in order to do something about overpopulation or overconsumption or climate disruption, right?
Yeah, a lot of them are actually doing it for economic purposes, because like you said in the intro, it's like they can have their money from their bigger lifestyle and they can shrink that down so they become millionaires, so that they can live in mansions but have the same economic value that they had before. So it's interesting because they have some the quotes in the movie. That's the main guy, Paul, says, it's like, you can really make a difference. And then other people were saying, it's like, no, we didn't do that for making a difference. And that really surprised this main character, because he's like, oh, I thought it'd be great to help the environment. And he's really in awe by it. And then everyone else is like, no, we're trying to like live the good life, I guess. So it's interesting.
But in a way, it really mirrors what I think we see going on in the world today, which is environmentalists may understand human behavior that we need, but they don't have enough faith in human beings to tell them the truth about why they ought to alter their behavior. So they beat around the bush and they come up with other ways to get human beings to do what's needed to be done. They say, why take a chance on people not receiving well this information that we're overpopulated and we need to have fewer children, when we can kind of do an end run around that tough subject. And so they sort of do that here, right? They don't say, hey, shrink your footprint, sign up, pay big bucks to shrink your footprint. They say, sign up, pay big bucks, and the little bucks that you have in the bank suddenly will be big bucks because it doesn't cost you nearly as much to live in a mansion, to live very high on the hog, caviar for dinner every other night.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea because that is something that's in our society that everyone's more so centered on their own life. They want to know, like, what can make my life better, and not necessarily a holistic view. But people have realized that, and that's why they're marketing these ideas in such ways that they're like, okay, we have to figure out how people will look at it a certain way so we can almost trick them, I guess, into doing something better for the planet. But I think it's interesting because a lot of people, if they were more educated about like why the actual reasons, they might be more inclined to maybe take more sustainable efforts. But it's been like we are almost conditioned to be like, okay, it's this other reason. So unless you really are educated about it, or I guess want to know about the environment, it's kind of hard to learn about it in some ways.
Yep. But that's not the main reason we decided to talk about this film, is it? What do you think what's in your view the most relevant and noteworthy thing?
With this movie, I thought it was really interesting how in the end, the Norwegian scientists ended up actually being very pessimistic. He was like, we're not doing this fast enough. So it's like that lesson that I think that they learned, that they were like almost too late because people didn't want to change their mind. Not enough people were shrinking down, and that there was almost too late. And in the movie, it's kind of vague if he was actually right or not. But it still is that idea that it's taking extreme of what our society is doing. It's like we're not sure when there'll be a point when we're not going to be able to turn back and change. And I think we've kind of reached that point. It's like it's some of the damage we're causing to the environment is not really changeable at this point. We're kind of tipping over the edge. But I think it was interesting how this movie conveyed it in a certain way, that it's like leaves really vague, but it still gives that like push to the point.
So one of the things I liked about the film was it was just brutally honest about not just the fact that we had overpopulation and that we were seriously disrupting the climate, but that we were facing the collapse of civilization. And in fact, as you mentioned, that it was really unavoidable because we weren't changing our ways fast enough. And that's a pretty dark subject that a lot of people don't want to go to. And yet here they did this in this Hollywood film with a couple of A-list stars.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's not an idea that people want to talk about, and they even mimic that in the movie because, like, Matt Damon doesn't end up going down the hole to the society that is trying to, like, expand the human civilization. He decides, okay, I'm not going to deal with this now. They end up saying it's for love. But he does go back to his other life because he almost isn't facing the idea that, like, this could be the end of the humans because of the population problem.
I think he was choosing a meaningful life because he had something meaningful to do by not trying to save himself to emerge on the other side of collapse, I guess.
Yeah, I thought this movie did well with trying to represent a lot of different aspects of our society and different viewpoints about the environment, the people that maybe would be involved in environmental things but would not. Like some of the Paul's friends, they were trying to be economic gain and trying to, what was the guy's name? It was the one that went to Norway with him in the boat. Well, the boat guy.
Yeah, the boat guy.
Yeah, they both shrunk down for the economic, standpoint and not the environmental. But I think it was interesting. They still did shrink down. So it's like, and then there are people that didn't shrink down at all because they were like, oh, well, it's not going to matter. So I thought it had a very wide array of people, which is not something you really see in a lot of movies. Sometimes you'll just have like the director's or the producer's point of view. It's like, we want this one shown. So I think they did well with showing an array and like compare and contrast those.
There was one thing that really bugged me about the story, and that was that downsizing was developed as a solution to overpopulation. And the scientist in the story clearly in developing downsizing must have assumed that the other solutions weren't solutions. He basically dismissed the idea of raising widespread awareness and changing human behavior and convincing and otherwise enabling young adults around the world to make small family decisions, because we could shrink the total human footprint fairly easily just by all having fewer children in our families. Instead, he goes to all of the trouble of developing this technological solution to physically shrink us. And you would think that, wow, I mean, that's a pretty scary idea. And I think the movie does a pretty good job of addressing that part of it. That means it's a significant change in your life. You've got to be really bold to make that leap, because there's no going back. Wouldn't it be so much easier to just say, hey, today the average family needs to be one child? You know, if you want your children to have a decent world and a decent life, the era of 4 children in a family or 6 kids in a family is behind us. Just much simpler.
Yeah, I feel like that's more of a realistic thing to say, okay, we're going to, obviously this is a science fiction movie, so like these technology is not possible, but it is more realistic to say, okay, we're going to educate people. But I think he wanted an easier way. It's like, I know I can do this science. So it's like he was almost an escape for him to be like, okay, this is a solution. I'm just going to go for it, instead of trying to do the long haul of educating people and maybe trying to change people's minds, because that can also be hard. But could be more realistic and something that we can actually do as a society. Yeah, and it just bugs me because it feels like he doesn't give us the credit that maybe we don't deserve. Yeah.
We're in the process of finding out whether we deserve credit or not.
Yeah. I mean, education does work to some extent because, in Japan, they have fewer children now, and they've been more successful in the technological advancements in the recent years. And it's interesting to look at societies like that. And then there's been more education in India, and they've been reducing their population a lot. So it is working to some extent, but I guess you could see it, maybe it's not working fast enough, but it's like you have to give it some time, education. So
now I want to ask you about this other thing that bugged me a little bit, and that is this notion that people could continue to live the good life or the American dream, whatever you want to call it, and do it sustainably because they're now tiny. So their footprint shrinks, but they can live in a McMansion and live. It's kind of ironic. They can live a big life, but they can do that because they're tiny. And do you feel like the movie addressed at all the notion that, living the good life, living large, doesn't really bring joy to our lives? It doesn't really make us happy. I didn't feel like the movie challenged that notion of the fact that we need a new definition for the good life.
Well, I think it's interesting because most of the characters in the movie did want the McMansion and like these huge things. But I feel like they maybe touched on it not enough as it could have with Paul, because he ended up having that huge mansion, and then he went back and figured out that the purpose in life he wanted was to help people. And he ended up finding, his purpose in love because of that. But I feel like they could have expanded that more in other people, because he seemed like one of the very few characters in the movie that was like, oh, I'm going to actually find a purpose instead of just have things, which was, I feel like they could have had a stronger message, like you're saying, if they kind of were like, okay, we need to reassess what the idea of, like, why do people want all these things? And is it still the same when you're small or when you're big, or things like that?
No, I've talked quite a bit about the overpopulation angle. Now I've at least brought up the overconsumption part of it with this living the good life deal. But let's talk more about overconsumption. It's probably pretty clear that the scientists assumed, regardless of what they do about family size and procreation, we're not going to get people to live more simply. We're not going to get people to give up their pursuit of things like trophy homes and bigger cars, nicer cars, more air travel, all of that. So, yeah, let's develop this technology to shrink people, and then we've solved the carbon emissions problem at the very least. And I'm not quite as unforgiving of that assumption, just because so far that's the one thing we haven't demonstrated. We haven't demonstrated, we human beings, that very many of us are really willing to skinny up our lives and pursue what really matters in life, which isn't bigger and more stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of weird for me to think about, because a lot of people that I know, it's like if they have the means to, buy all the nice clothes, all the nice cars and stuff, they will do it. They think it's just because I have the money, it's my right to basically buy all this extra stuff. But in my mind, even though you have, the means to do that, if you're fortunate enough, it doesn't mean you should do that. You should think more of like, do I actually need these things? Is it going to make me happy? And it's just, I guess, a different mindset that it's sometimes hard to grasp. It's like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So I think that's interesting because like you have to look at things in your life, which is hard because I know a lot of people don't want to think about, okay, if I buy all this stuff, what am I going to do with it? Because they think in the moment like, oh, this is a cool thing, I'm going to get it. So I think the overconsumption idea is definitely ingrained in our head because, we're marketed to be like, buy more. It's like, here's a sale, get this. So it's definitely a more modern mindset, I think, because in the past, we would mend things and do stuff like that because with more, factories and more mass production, we have the ability to buy more, and we are, which is also another problem that, kind of touches with overconsumption. So.
Now, there was one thing the movie brought up which really impressed me, and that was the fact that if a bunch of people, a significant portion of the population, are shrinking themselves and thereby shrinking their footprint, then they are shrinking their consumption. They're shrinking their, I hate to use the word contribution because that sounds so positive, but their contribution to the economy. They raise the subject in the film that the economy is potentially going to suffer because these people are no longer consuming so much. Did that catch your eye? Did you have anything to say about that?
I think with that topic, the idea that people are even worried about that we're having a portion of our society taking away from the consumption and the economic is almost a very modern idea because we're so used to have our economy like continually growing or continually expanding that we just think that that's always how it is, that we're always just going to expand and expand and expand.
Yeah.
But I think people need to realize like there's going to be a breaking point, that it's not going to be able to reach that forever. Like you can't continually grow and, like we said, be sustainable like that. So people in the movie were kind of worried about that, but it is a problem, I guess, if they're not contributing the economic as much, because then there were some like rights issues that they brought up. That's whole nother topic. But
yeah, you've turned the corner just beautifully into what I hoped we might chat about a little bit, and that is that let's just say we don't have the technology to shrink ourselves, and yet hopefully more and more of us are still shrinking our footprints because we know that that's what needs to be done because we are in overshoot. We can't just shrink the human population because we're so far into overshoot. We've got to shrink the human population and we've got to shrink the global economy. And there are those who would say, wow, you're going to completely destroy the economy. The system is not going to react well to that.
Yeah. I feel like people are so pessimistic about it sometimes, but in my mind, it's like a fact that will happen at some point. Like you have to realize that you can't have the whole economic gain all the time, and that's what they're only concerned about. They're not concerned about the effects of having your economy grow all the time. They're just like, oh, money, money, money. That's all I want. But it's like you have to shrink your footprint at some point.
Most people don't realize that, though.
No.
And so they're going to complain that, wow, if everybody shrinks their footprint, then the economy is going to be a mess. And it may be a little bit of a mess. I mean, the truth is we've built an economic system that depends on ever-expanding economic throughput. If we aren't buying more cars year after year, if we're not spending more money this year on Black Friday and Cyber Monday than we did the year before, that is certainly portrayed in the news media as problematic, and the economic policymakers do everything in their power to prevent that from happening. And it's because we have a system that does suffer. It doesn't run well if we aren't doing that. And yet you and I know we're going to have to get over that at some point. We're going to have to go through that pain of, I guess, letting the economy adjust and become less dependent on growth and be healthier.
Because in the past and, history, we've had room to expand and room to grow. Like we had explorers all over the world. And it's that, historical context that people, subconsciously know. It's like we did have room in the past. And it's like you have to make the connection. It's like we don't really have that much more room on this planet. Like we've reached every part of the globe, basically. We have to realize that there's no more room, basically. And I don't know what will cause people to realize that, but hopefully us talking about it will maybe get some people interested.
Well, we're working on that. And so I was glad to see that briefly addressed in the film because it's an issue that we face today. I mean, we face it in some ways in that all of the hand-wringing over Japan's declining population is really based on the fact that the economy can't continue to grow at the rapid pace that we've come to expect over the last few decades. And you even see that a little bit about the United States, that there are people today, growth boosters, growth pushers, whatever you want to call them, who think we need to be birthing more babies in the United States. And it's all based on this concern about propping up this Ponzi economy that we've invented.
Yeah.
Anything else about the film?
I think an interesting side note about just environmental films in general, and this one had a good point that even though we might not agree totally with what they decided to do with the trying to fight climate, they did have this climate mitigation as their goal. When a lot of films, we'd looked at, they're kind of disaster apocalyptic, that they're like, okay, humans are terrible. This is all the stuff that happened because of it. So I feel like this could be like a turn for movies that they're trying to, for the media in general, that they're trying to at least find some problems. They might not be ones we totally agree with, but there are aspects that they are trying to figure out reasons and ways to, change their environmental impact, I guess. So it's not wholly pessimistic.
Yeah. And, I think we've been more preachy in our discussion of the film than the film was. I don't want people to think that the film is preachy because it really isn't.
Yeah, no, we're just kind of delving into it a lot more.
Yeah. So you may know if you've read up on it or if you research it a little bit, you may know that it wasn't a big box office success. But I don't want that to put you off from checking it out if you haven't seen the film, because I think it probably deserved to be seen by more people than saw it. And, as we mentioned, a couple of A-list actors, and it was directed by Alexander Payne. He was the guy who directed Sideways, very critically acclaimed film, really cool film, and the film Nebraska also. So the guy does quality work, and I hope this goes down. Downsizing should go down in history as at least as important and significant as a movie like Sideways.
Yeah, I think it is definitely something that I hope people will continue to try to watch and realize that it is a good movie, and we are talking about the environmental aspects a lot, but the movie shows a lot of interesting realizations about our society in general, not just environmental, but just our mindset, which is something kind of refreshing, I feel like, with modern movies. So.
Cool. So I'm pretty impressed with that conversation, Dana. I think, in a way, this is sort of an audition and you're passing with flying colors.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Wasn't sure we'd keep you, but I think we might just have to keep you. We may be making some changes now that Dana is on board, but we're not changing things too fast. But we usually have this segment called Lightening the Load. And I have a pretty good one, I think, for this week. And it came to mind because I've been seeing some recent news about this item, and that is disposable straws. Disposable straws made of plastic. I guess you don't have to think about it very long and hard to know that it's really not very good. They're going to be in the environment for a long time, and disposable anything is not as good as reusable something. There's a few beverages I like sipping through a straw. If I have a Coke, the occasional Coke, I like to sip it through a straw. The occasional pina colada tastes pretty darn good through a straw. And so what I did long ago is got some reusable straws. They can be washed and reused time and time again, so I'm not throwing anything away, and I can have my beverage sipped through a straw. So that's what I wanted to share with you today about what I'm doing, one of the many things I'm doing to lighten the load.
Last semester, we had a campaign on my campus. It was Go Wasteless, and it was a whole thing about trying to limit your waste, and it was one of the committees I was involved in, and one of our gifts that we gave out was a metal straw so that people could, on campus, use that instead, because I go to Starbucks a lot. It's probably bad. I try to go very few, but when I do go, I try to bring my metal straw with me so I can at least not have the straw to throw away, because at least the cup I can try to recycle. But it's interesting because so many people were excited about that. Like all these college students are like, oh my gosh, a metal straw. And we're like, oh yeah, look, here's your gift. So it was interesting to see these 20-year-olds be like, oh, I'm saving the environment with my straw. But,
now, thinking about this and reading some news stories about the fact that straws are becoming big news, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But because of that, I thought about the fact that when I go to a restaurant, if I shoot sometimes even with a glass of water, they will have a straw already in that. They won't ask you. They will just give you a straw. And if you get they won't do it on water refills, but if you're getting a refill on another beverage where they take your glass away and bring it back to the table, or they just bring you another glass with the beverage you're drinking, you're going to have another straw in there. So you could end up going through a couple of disposable straws in a meal at a restaurant. And it hadn't really dawned on me that, one, I could and should be very proactive about and say, please do not bring me a straw. I could be. And I'm going to from now on. And two, well, heck, if I really want to be using a straw when I go out to that restaurant, I can just take one of my reusable straws with me, just like I'm trying to train myself to bring a reusable leftover container with me so that I am not given some disposable case if I bring leftovers home. So those are a couple things that I've yet to do in my journey. And that's why we call it a journey, a journey to sustainability. But let's talk a little bit more about straws, because I was really fascinated to discover that, well, for one, there's a great program in Portland that's been going on for about a year, a campaign to actually change individual behavior, but also to really encourage restaurants to eliminate plastic straws from their pantry, or at the very least to not just automatically serve beverages with straws, to have straws available only if a customer asks. And in some cases, to step that up a little bit, if you are going to have straws available, to not have plastic straws available, but to have stainless steel straws or other reusable straws, or worst case, paper straws, which do eventually completely biodegrade in the environment.
With a lot of things with plastic straws or any sort of plastic, like silverware or plates or all these disposable things, it's a weird mindset that we have that it's like such a ephemeral activity that we're using it for, and yet they last so long. So I feel like if people they weren't as afraid to bring these reusable items that you could buy easily and it would overall be cheaper, that it would help a lot. Because if you bring your reusable napkin, your reusable straw, your containers, it's not something that's hard to do. It's just some people are like, oh, I don't want to look weird bringing it. But like, I will pull out my reusable napkin and use it, and people will look at me, but I'm like, I don't care. It's something that I'm passionate about that I want to keep. And then people sometimes ask me questions like, why do you have this napkin? I'm like, well, I'll explain it to you. So at least it might be annoying sometimes, but I feel like if we can kind of tell people like, this item, you don't really need to use a plastic straw. There's other alternatives.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact that it is really such a non-essential item. And I think that's why it's so important, because it's really probably not a lot of weight of plastic that's getting used and thrown away, but it is really so unneeded. I mean, you can drink that beverage without a straw. You might be giving up a little bit of joy, and like I said, when I want the joy of sipping something through a straw, well, I darn well can bring my reusable straw. But interestingly, straws do eventually break down, but they break down into microplastic, and that's ingested by marine animals. It always ends up finding its way into our oceans. And by 2050, it's estimated that there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish.
That's a scary thought.
Yes, that's a scary thought. And certainly we can do something about it. It's estimated that Americans use about 500 million plastic straws every fill in the blank.
That's probably every day.
Yeah. Not every year, not every month, not every week, every day.
Well, I feel like people just don't realize the impact. They're like, oh, it's just a straw. And I'm like, but you're using that straw. Say you get a lunch and dinner, and then you do that every day of the week. It's like, and everyone else is doing that. Or if you get a coffee too, you could be using 3 straws a day. And it's like, what is that straw doing for you? It's just going to be for your drink, which you could drink out otherwise without it.
Yep.
So it's just, they don't think about that. Like, if it goes in the trash, it goes away. Like, that's not how trash works. There's something happens after it. So.
Yeah, and in fact, there was mention of a YouTube video that apparently went viral in 2015, which was of a sea turtle that marine biologists had come across, and the sea turtle had a plastic straw stuffed up its nose.
I'd seen that.
Did you see that?
It made me cringe. Oh
my God. I watched it, and, gosh, I don't think there's ever a YouTube video that makes me cry. Maybe one or two in a million years. But it took them 8 minutes to get the straw out of that nose of that sea turtle, and it seemed like an hour. And you could just see how much it hurt that turtle. I was crying, and it really made me feel like, okay, man, you are not going to do something stupid with disposable straw ever again.
I think it would be really funny. They would never do this, but you know how in cigarette boxes they have like these, in Europe, they have these terrible images of like you get lung cancer. It's like when you buy a straw, you put the picture of the turtle on it. It's like, this could happen to your straw if you use it. It'd be a very big deterrent. But
Yeah. So in the show notes, I'm going to include a link to this video. So if you need just a little bit of extra motivation to order your reusable straws today, you'll get it. And I'm also going to include a link to the 5 best reusable straws on the Wisebread website. So I'll include that very quickly. It'll kind of give you a shortcut to do some of the research so that you can do what you need to do to eliminate disposable straws from your life. Okay, so last thing. So here's Dana and Dave, who just earlier in the episode were talking about the potential collapse of human civilization. And then here we are toward the end of the episode talking about eliminating plastic straws. Really? Do you think eliminating disposable plastic straws is going to avoid the collapse of human civilization?
I don't think it's going to avoid it, but it could help.
Yeah, and it's going to help, and it's only going to help a tiny bit. So why do we talk about these things? Well, I don't know about you. I'd like to know what you think, but I'll offer my opinion, and that is the reason I do that, because it does seem a little almost insignificant in the grand scheme of the sustainability of human civilization. One is every human behavior, as little as it is, it adds up if a lot of people are doing it. A lot of people don't think it makes a lot of difference. If I do this, if I recycle, or if I only have one child, or if I have 0 children, or if I ride my bike to work instead of driving my car, look at all those other millions of people. But what if there are millions of people adopting this behavior? What if there are tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people? Then it really does multiply and add up, and that makes a difference. And then the other thing is, if we are doing these kinds of things in our lives, then it just becomes more front of mind. We start to think about other ways that we can shrink our footprint. And I think it becomes easier for us to then ultimately do what we must do, which is make the big changes that we need to make in the system so that we change the course of human civilization. So that's why I'm willing to talk about disposable plastic straws in the same conversation where we're talking about human civilization potentially disappearing from the planet.
Yeah, it's crazy if you think about it, because it's every movement, everything that happened in history basically had to start with one person. So no matter what scale you make these changes, if you just change your straw, and even though you might feel like you're just one person, that change can cause other people to say, oh, look at this person that's doing this in their lives, and they might also want to do it. And it's that, like I said before, it's like when you do that one thing, people will ask you questions like, why are you doing that? And just the act of doing it will make people more aware. And then you'll be telling people, and then they might tell their friends, and it might be the context of like, oh, this person, they might be weird, they're doing this, but then they'll still talk about it. They'll be like, they're doing this thing that other people aren't doing. And I think that's kind of interesting and cool. That's like, it's this conversation starter that you're saying like, oh, I'm doing this, and I do believe in something bigger than myself, which a lot of people might not do. So
it's like you're creating an epidemic, a good epidemic.
Yeah.
And I like that. Yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. That's as valuable as the other reasons that I brought up for doing that. So what do you think? How do you think we have done the new dynamic duo of Dana and Dave?
I think it's working out pretty well. We've been having these good conversations about straws and turtles and downsizing. So interesting topics, but they all connect to sustainability, which is great.
I think you made an incredibly positive contribution today. So I'm impressed, and I'm pretty jazzed about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it could be a good team.
Don't forget to explore more issues at growthbusters.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app and give us a review if you like what we're doing. We want to know. If you haven't seen the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, you can find it at growthbustersmovie.org or on Amazon.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some they just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.